as limited as the private citizen. What is not supported by the average person cannot be attained by his leaders. And the average person today is not supporting. He is so much more against what he does not like than he is for what he does like, that practically every progressive effort of society runs into argument, discord, and confusion. The individual, then, being forced to live in a world essentially unsatisfactory to him, but a world which he has not the dynamic to change, a world in which perhaps his own attitudes are minority attitudes, and there is not sufficient support from others to make his projects possible. This individual falls back into hopelessness. He falls back into frustration. He gives up and takes various escape mechanisms as the only possible way to adjust to the pressures of living. These defeatisms are evident everywhere today, and we find an increasing tendency to ignore problems or to regard them as hopeless, or to attempt to adjust to some compromise solution. We have often pointed out that if it is true that the individual must be the victim of collective pressures, then there cannot be any basic integrity in the universe. We are also reminded constantly of an increasing number of persons who do not believe that there is any essential integrity in the universe. They do not believe this because they cannot demonstrate it from their own experience. The philosophy by which we live is derived from our own observation and participation in living problems. If, therefore, we are unable to perceive law and order in the patterns which particularly affect us, we are not likely to acknowledge law and order in larger patterns more remote. So today there is an constantly increasing intensity of negation. The individual doubts. He no longer holds it to be essentially true that there is a patterned purpose behind life. If this negation continues to develop, we are bound to drift into an almost hopeless skepticism. But man himself finds his own drifting increasingly uncomfortable. He discovers that actually the kind of a universe he lives in is not nearly as important to him as what he thinks about the kind of universe he lives in. It is his own adjustment that must, to a large measure, determine his relationships with life. He learns also, of course, that there is only one essential contribution that he can make as a private citizen, and that is the contribution of a well-ordered conduct of his own. He cannot give to others what he does not have. He cannot demand anything from others with an assurance that he will receive it. But he can bestow of what he is or of what he has according to his own insight and understanding. It therefore becomes important to the average person to enrich his own potential of interpretation and understanding. Unless he can do this, he cannot hope to maintain a creditable place in the life pattern of which he is a part. We must admit, and we know it is true from continually increasing evidence, that all negative attitudes are essentially destructive to the person who holds them and to those around that person. Negative attitudes must be compensated for in terms of unhappiness, sickness, and premature death. There can be no possible way in which a negative attitude or a destructive attitude can essentially and directly contribute to our security. The only way that it can contribute is because we ultimately discover the wrongness of it and are thereby perhaps impelled to search a better attitude. Actually, anything that is wrong in our own emotional and mental life will be interpreted ultimately in terms of misery and sickness. We cannot win with negation. We cannot criticize ourselves into health, but we can criticize ourselves into sickness. We cannot hate ourselves into peace of mind, but we can destroy mind and its peace with hate. Every negative attitude, no matter how much we defend our right to have it, or how justified it seems to be, must end in a negation in our own natures. Thus, the person who is a critic gradually destroys his social bridges. He becomes an outcast, and in loneliness and sorrow watches his life disintegrate. He will insist that his criticisms are valid, that what he says is true, but if it is negative, it does not help. And the individual whose discrimination, whose thoughtfulness continually lead him into negative discovery or the discovery of error, this individual ultimately becomes habit-ridden with negation and loses the power and the incentives to constructive thought. Nearly all of our psychological trouble today rests with unadjusted persons who have permitted themselves to develop negative mental and emotional habits. And as it is estimated now that in the next generation, at least 1 out of every 5 persons born in the United States will at some time be an occupant of a mental hospital. It begins to be a rather serious situation. And most of these persons, and I have worked with hundreds and thousands of them, who are in these hospitals are persons who have permitted bad habits of mind and emotion to come in and control their lives. Many of these persons have excellent explanations for why they are as they are. But such explanations do not help. The only explanation that is of any value to us is the explanation of how we stayed sane. The rest of it is not profitable. These individuals who are mentally and emotionally sick can prove to our satisfaction, perhaps, to their own satisfaction, certainly, that they are misunderstood, neglected, afflicted human beings, born in calamity and misery, and therefore fully entitled to fall to pieces. All this, however, does not solve anything, and the perpetuation of a philosophy of this kind cannot possibly bring any satisfaction, security, or health to anyone. The answer lies in a positive relationship with life. Now, in going back over a good many of these sorrowful characteristic problems, we find that the individual who has come to these melancholy and morbid conclusions actually did not have a particularly difficult life. The individual who breaks under pressure is one of a community of persons, most of whom have had equal pressures with himself. It is not the individual who has gone through the most that falls to pieces. It is the individual with the least resource in himself. It is not the person who has gone through the greatest tragedy who is tragedy-ridden. It is the individual, perhaps, whose only tragedy has been his own selfishness. But the person who has the wrong basic perspective gradually cultivates a philosophy of negation.